thank you all for joining tonight. This is the launch for Artificial Futures. I have always had a really complicated relationship with technology because on one hand, I was always, that little gadget freak that was taking apart his dad's old radios and stuff like that and playing with Legos until I was way too old that I shouldn't have been anymore. And on the other hand, I have talked openly about having a nervous breakdown in 2014 that I attribute a lot to technology. And I've also seen a lot of bad that has come out of the valley. And so for me, it was how do I both love and appreciate the power of technology while also trying to do some good with it. And when I looked at that and when I thought about how that all comes together, I had to say, okay, I've just finished this PhD. What can I now do that is important in the world? And of course, based on the PhD that I just did, well, I just spent a lot of years deeply immersed in automation. And this is, thank you, Captain Obvious, automation, AI and robotics are everywhere and they're only expanding. And it's been kind of cool to see because I know for some of you who knew me back at McGill, 20 years ago, I was your weird robot friend that did work for the US military and you all kind of made jokes about, but you didn't fully know what I was doing. It's been nice to see that over the last 5, 10, 15 years, this stuff has become more and more commonplace. And instead of me being your weird friend, suddenly you're all coming up and talking to me about, hey, what's going on with ChatGPT? Or what are these new things that are coming out that I don't fully understand, but seem like they're gonna make some big splashes? And it's exciting because yes, this stuff is becoming more and more prevalent and it's starting to integrate further and further into our lives, but it's problematic because the reality is a lot of it is frickin' terrible. I am a big proponent of how cool technology can be, but the problem is a lot of it's just not cool anymore. There's some stuff that's still really interesting and some stuff that's well designed, but there's a lot of automation now that is starting to feel less and less like it's being designed for us and more like it's being designed against us. It is frustrating at best in some cases and dehumanizing at worst in others. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that we don't have the right vocabulary or approaches to designing technology anymore. We got really good at building websites and apps and things like that because user experience became exceptionally refined over the years. But the problem is this isn't technology anymore. This isn't what we're dealing with now. Nowadays, we lack what user experience looks like for the age of automation. We don't know how to design chatbots, robots, artificial intelligence agents that we interact with on a daily basis in a way that is healthy, enjoyable, but still, yes, efficient, of course. And when I look at anything, many of you know my weird brain likes to look back at history. If I want to know about how technology works, I'll go all the way back to the Luddites of the late 1700s and say, well, what happened there that people decided to break a bunch of looms? Why did that happen? And when I look at some of the issues that I'm tackling now, I like to look all the way back to actually the start of the Industrial Revolution. We started to see the power that these breaking work down into smaller and smaller pieces could have. And the Industrial Revolution was really perfected by Ford's assembly line. And this stuff got so good that it fascinated industry for 2 world wars and through a lot of the early 50s and 60s and 70s. But we hit a bit of a roadblock because at that point, computers also started to become a thing. And more in the 70s, they were starting to get introduced into different offices and put on people's desks. And these weird images are kind of a fascinating thing. This is from an ethnography that Shoshana Zuboff, a professor at Harvard, did, where she went into offices that were putting computers on people's desks in the 70s at banks. And she asked those people to describe their experience and sometimes even to draw their experience. And these are some of the things that came out. So my supervisor is frowning because we shouldn't be talking. I have on the stripes of a convict. It's all true, it feels like a prison in here. Or no talking, no walking. I have a cork in my mouth, blinders on my eyes, chains on my arms. With the radiation, I've lost my hair. The only way you can make your production goals is to give up your freedom. Wow! That is some visceral language for literally sticking a computer on somebody's desk. And of course, the irony is now, 50 years later, we all happily put them on our desks, on our beds and our couches. They are in every parts of our lives. But there's a reason we're able to do that now, because the computers that we have are different from these computers. Because this is something that actually UX did really well. After World War II, we had a big change in how we viewed processes and technologies. Places like Bell Labs started hiring cognitive scientists to figure out how to design the ideal touch-tone telephone. You had people like Xerox PARC essentially invent the modern computer, created the GUI, the mouse, all these things. And then, Steve Jobs came along one day and stole it all and made the Macintosh, which was a great business move. And then, of course, you had a guy named Don Norman at Apple in the late 80s coined the term user experience design. And this was a really important moment because what it did is it took these sort of awkward and terrible computer systems that had been designed by and for computer engineers, and it democratized them. It made it so that we can all use them. And maybe it's just because I'm nostalgic for the 90s because I grew up then, but I thought the 90s were a really cool time for computers. I remember we used to play on our GeoCities pages and like try to sort of figure out weird things on the school computers in HyperCard on the Macs. It was a really open and exploratory time because user experience had made these technical systems that were open enough for anyone to play with and learn from. But of course, that was 30, 35 years ago. And at this point, UX has become refined. It's become pretty standard. And beyond that, it's unfortunately become poisoned. Because the reality is, user experience design as we know it today is not the beautiful vision that it was taken originally in the late 80s. In fact, one of the sort of awkward parts is that the top UX course in the world is currently run by Google. It seems like a bit of a conflict of interest when you consider that Google is also one of the companies that is harvesting much of our data and using it to then grab us and pull us into its platforms to optimize for amount of time that we're going to spend and maybe even to influence us. You get platforms like Facebook that, in addition to gathering immense amounts of data, also are one of the largest buyers of data in the world to learn about you. So that, again, they can influence you, they can learn more about you, they can pull you into this ecosystem. UX used to be a tool for us, and now it feels like a tool that's weaponized against us. And the other half is that even if the principles of UX held up, at this point it's just out of date. It's now over 30 years old, and while this was really valuable for those screen-based interactions that we talked about before, you think about the strategy of what are the objectives I'm trying to accomplish, think about the scope of different features that you want to have, the structure of how you put different information forward, the skeleton of how different things piece together, and then the surface of how it all looks. Things like Garrett's 5 elements were a really good way of designing a website or an app. But this is insufficient when we start thinking about what technology is today, because we're not looking at screens anymore. We're talking to Alexa, we're high-fiving a robot, or we're dealing with a pervasive system that exists in our lives that we don't even necessarily realize is influencing us. And the reality is why this isn't working is because AI and robotics just aren't that simple. As a roboticist, I look at this and I see, oh, yeah, over there we have what looks like a 9 degree of freedom arm, 3 and 3, that's articulated at certain angles to hold up like this. It's probably having to apply a current through the arm so that it holds static. The rest of you in the room are looking at it and going, hey, cool, the robot's waving at me. And that's kind of a funny thing, though, because the robot is waving at you. Because there's an emergent property when we start building systems that are human-like, which is that we see ourselves in them. And we aren't necessarily going to see ourselves in a website, but this changes everything. Because it looks a little bit like us, we want to believe that it is like us. And so that means that we can't just use the same old UX that we've been doing for years. We need to think beyond this. And there's two big things that are missing. Number one is semiotics, which is just the meaning of things. But the meaning of a website is very different because all you really have to think about is the text and the layout and the colors. Now we suddenly have things that are coming in which have, arms, or they have faces, they have facial expressions, they have vocal intonation if it has a voice, their choice of words, even the pacing of how it talks. All of that is a form of communication that, whether or not we realize it, affects how we perceive these things. And the other half is when these things start talking to us as though they are people, we start believing it, and we start forming relationships with them. They start to become social in ways they never have been before. And so this starts to change everything. So let's drill a bit deeper on this. Semiotics, like I said, is defined by the meaning derived from a broad set of signs. And signs are just different modalities, how you move your legs, how you talk, all these different things. Let me give you some examples. So this is some great research that was done by Angelica Lim at Simon Fraser University maybe about 10 years ago, and I love this. I saw her talk about it once. She asked a simple question, and I'll ask all of you this as well. Why is the following statement so creepy?
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
Anyone? It's the doom. Well, yeah, okay, so the obvious answer is yes, that, it's creepy because the robot is denying Dave to open that pod bay door. And that's a really pivotal moment in the movie. But what's interesting is why the specific voice is so creepy is because Angelica was a researcher that studied vocal intonation. And when she ran that voice through, the voice actor that did this was brilliant because that voice comes out when you analyze the emotion of it as calm. So think about this. If I'm saying to you, hey, I'm sorry, Darnell, I can't help you with this, I probably have a bit of empathy, maybe fear, maybe even, a little timidness in my voice, because I am truly sorry about that. But instead, this voice is calm, cool as a cucumber. It's happy. That's why it's so creepy. This is the same reason that when you're on the phone with Rogers or TELUS and you're mashing the thing, trying to just get to a human operator, and then some chipper little voice comes on and says, it looks like you're having trouble using our automated system. We're sorry, goodbye, and hangs up on you. You're infuriated because that voice had the gall to be happy about hanging up on you. And companies aren't understanding that you can't just build some vanilla, slightly positive automation system because the human experience is not always positive. Sometimes we have to think beyond that. What about kinesics, how things move? So these are two robots that exist in the world. One, many of you will know, is Hansen's Sophia robot. And the other one here is Amica by Engineered Arts. They're both sort of two sides of the same coin. Sophia is a great robot because it looks very human-like, but you'll notice the motions are kind of awkward, and that sets something off in you. It kind of makes you feel weird. That's called the uncanny valley effect, because what's happening is you're seeing something that looks kind of human-like, but not quite. And so instead, you look at Amica, and Amica looks very fluid and motion-like, but doesn't look a thing like a human. And so that sets off another weird trigger. And in fact, the appearance of these things and how they move will affect how you approach them. You'll think differently about them because of how they look. And so their appearances also have a lot of play. This is some really cool research that was going on in the Netherlands by a researcher, Christoph Bartnek, and his crew. And you're probably wondering why there's a man in his underwear in front of a small cat-like robot. So what they did in this experiment was they had people come in for a mock medical exam, where they put people through a series of increasingly invasive medical procedures. Started off with something like stick out your tongue and let's take a look, and it ended all the way up to drop your trousers and we have to rectally administer a thermometer. Now, there were 3 conditions in which this happened. In one, you had this little cat with a little health band on it. In the second, it had the cat without the health band on it to not indicate that it's any kind of medical robot. And in the third, the cat was gone and it was just a box. Now, the most interesting part of this study is that in any of those conditions, people still put the thermometer up their ass, which I think is insane. But the most interesting finding of this is actually when they started surveying people about how they felt about the situation. And they asked about levels of embarrassment. And what you see here is the first 2 lines. Those are the ones with the cat, either with or without the medical band. And people were quite embarrassed by those. This third one, though, is the box. So literally, even though all you're doing is getting rid of this thing with a face, that drastically lowers the embarrassment people feel about these invasive medical procedures. And it's funny because there's a lot of instances where people just assume the more human-like something is, the better. But actually, there's a lot of instances where, in fact, it's more important for you to think about something looking maybe machine-like, or animal-like, or yes, in some cases, human-like. It all depends on the context of what you're trying to do with that person. Even chronemics, the timing of things, your pacing. This is such simple but incredible research where all they did to publish a paper was they had people interacting with a chatbot, and the only conditions that they had were the chatbot either responds to you immediately or there's a small random delay, anywhere from 5 to 100 milliseconds. And what they found, sure enough, that delay increased our perceived humanness of the chatbot, our increased social presence, and even your satisfaction, how you feel about it. So this is counterintuitive. The engineer in me would go, well, let's just make it as fast as possible. But actually, if you want to create a more humane system, there should be a delay in there. There should be something that shows it's maybe thinking about it. These are things that are not intuitive to us at first, but that are so important to get right if we're trying to make systems that are more like us. The second half is where it starts to get really creepy. Social is what we all are. It's why all of you are here tonight, because we've had some incredible experience over the way, or you wanted to meet new people because we are inherently social creatures. But now technology is starting to fill this role in a way it never has before. The first way it's doing that is through something that psychologists like to call mentalizing, which is our process of recognizing someone else's mind. And this is something that we actually develop at a young age, but not too young. Like 6, 7, 8, 9 years old is usually when this starts to come into play. It's why young children often treat their stuffed teddy the same that they would mommy and daddy. They don't actually realize the difference between the things that have their own mind and not. And what's really interesting, though, is that we do this with machines as well. One of my ground zero studies that I based a lot of my PhD research on was something called the media equation that was going on at Stanford in the 90s. Very simple but profound study. You're interacting on a desktop computer, doing a boring file renaming task, and the computer is popping up vaguely social messages, go us, or aren't we a great team? And then at the end, after you've done that, you do a short survey. The survey is done in one of two conditions. You either do the survey on the same computer that you've been playing on, or you do the survey on another computer just a meter away on the same desk. And what we found, the researchers saw, was that when people answered on the other computer, they were far more critical of the original machine. Exactly, think about that for a second. We won't talk shit about it to its face, but we have no problem talking about it behind its back to its buddy. What was going on here? Well, this phenomenon also became known as CASA, or computers as social actors. And it was a really pivotal moment in research on HCI and HRI because people realized that this is where we start to treat computers as though they are us. We are so hardwired for social connection that if something even says hello or waves slightly to you, there's a part of your brain, you're not so dumb to consciously think that this thing is human, but there's part of your brain that wants to play along. It wants to make a new friend. And so it says, all right, maybe this thing's a little bit like me. And now, of course, if we assigned it a mind, then of course we'll start to think about, well, what are its needs? What are its desires? We'll start to think about its personality. And this is where things get hairy. Maybe 10 years ago, you remember Microsoft. They released a chatbot on Twitter called Tay. And Tay was learning through Twitter by having other people interact with it. Nothing could ever go wrong if a chatbot learns from the internet, right? So very quickly, Tay became a drug-addicted, anti-feminist, anti-Semitic, and eventually just hated everyone. And of course, this was chortle-worthy to sort of look at the egg on Microsoft's face, but the reality is this was a huge PR nightmare for them because this was a representation of their brand. Now, you think big tech would learn, but fast forward 10 years and what happens to Facebook? Facebook, once again, produces a new chatbot that says, oh no, we denied that Trump ever lost. We denied climate change. And in fact, once again, because who doesn't love a good bit of anti-Semitism, we are anti-Semitic as well. Now, Facebook didn't even have the good fortune to think about this as another entity like Tay. They just called this the Facebook chatbot. So if you think that went over well for their brand, you're thinking wrong. But we don't just develop personality with these things. We start to develop relationships with them. Think about it. No matter how boring a person in this room, we're all going to have some form of relationship or some sort of perceptions with them. And this is easily identifiable when you look at stories like this. On the right here, you see Eugene Kudya, who is the founder of Replica. And on the left, you see her deceased friend, Roman. He passed away suddenly in 2015 when he was hit by a car in Moscow. And this was one of her best friends, and she didn't know how to process grief. They were both so young. She had never dealt with anything like this before, and it happened so fast. She used the tools she had at her disposal. She was a machine learning engineer, so she gathered all of his texts, all of his emails, and she built a Roman chatbot. And these are some of the interactions that we had with her. It looks like Roman was a bit of a nihilist. There was, no God, and, I miss you too, but, well, we know that I can't see you. And what was strange was that Kudya describes her interactions with this chatbot, that she kept talking to him for almost a year because she was seeing it as an outlet, as a way of dealing with her grief. And in fact, when she finally decided that it was getting unhealthy, she struggled to let go. She opened this up to many of Roman's friends, and they had a similar experience. And it was because even though this thing wasn't Roman, there was a part of him in there that we believed we could still connect to. In fact, these things don't even necessarily have to be alive at one point. Many of you might know the Sony Aibo, which is a small robotic dog. It was discontinued a little over a decade ago. But there were people that were so fanatic in this community that they kept on working with them and kept on playing with them. Problem is, robots don't last forever. So in the last 5 or 6 years, they finally started breaking down for good, and no one was there to repair them. So in Japan, they wanted some way of honoring these things. They became like pets to these people. And so there actually is a temple that in Japan will do last funeral rites for these robotic dogs. And their head priest of this temple was quoted as saying that all things have a bit of soul, so we should respect all things in the same way. And so, again, these are just toys. These are just robots. These are little dogs, and yet we get attached to them. So now think about what happens when those are the tools that Facebook is deploying on you, or that you're working with every day. That starts to get a little scary. And it makes you start to think, how can we expect better of technology? This is why today I am launching Artificial Futures, because I expect better of technology. I have lived and breathed this stuff in a complicated matter for now 20 years, and I'm never going to shed the fact that I love technology, but I do have to start to define a line and say, there is good and there is bad. And I want to be on the right side of that line. And so my goal with this is to work with companies to better design a strategy on how they want to deploy automation in a way that is humane, ethical, and also efficient. And also to create experiences that are enjoyable, that are things that we want to do, as opposed to things that we begrudgingly or even unconsciously fall into just because we have a dopamine circuit that's been hacked by some app algorithm. So to do this, I'm going to envision a world where, we start to work with people in a way that is ethical, efficient, and enjoyable. I want to create better experiences, not just stuff that we get addicted to. Or put a simpler way, I want to stop making shitty, dehumanizing technology. I want to make stuff that exists for us instead of against us. And I've had a lot of experience to know how these things happen. I did some great research last year with Microsoft, and in it, I got to interview about 20 people across the country, usually CTOs or heads of AI and data, talk to them about their projects and what was going well and what wasn't. And what fascinated me is they all said, oh man, our technical work is fantastic. As soon as we find the data, we know exactly what to do. But the number one reason these things fail, nobody wants to use it. Doesn't get adopted because no one thinks about the change management. No one thinks about the design of these systems. And so if these things keep getting better and better from a technical perspective, it doesn't matter. Because if your employees don't want to touch it, then it is ultimately a failure. The second reason is miscommunication. You have these massive visions from leaders who say, this is our future, this is where we're going to go, this is how we are going to transform our business. And they don't know how to speak tech. So it rolls down to the developers and it turns into something else because the developers don't know how to speak to the strategy. And then the third reason is just simple management. This is different technology from anything we've ever done before. Kanban, Agile, these things don't work. AI is a different beast and it needs to be managed differently. A lot more like what I got to do at Idea Couture for years. It's a much more innovative process now. So, user experience design needs to evolve. And that's why one of the core offerings is going to be around artificial experience design, where we'll think about the semiotics and the social aspects of what you do beyond all the other important stuff too. Our strategy will need to be more explicit about how we do things. Yes, we're going to think about how much we want to automate stuff, but we're also going to think about the human's role in it. Because you look at the types of roles that are going on today, and some of them are pretty cool. Investing is getting really, really interesting because people are learning how to use algorithms to identify what kind of trends exist in the market while still using human intuition to ultimately decide where to place those bets. On the negative side, though, you have places like Amazon that are doing reverse centaur work, which is when the AI is in charge of the human, and the human is just running around a warehouse trying to pick up things that a computer's told it to do. Or car sharing services that drip feed you just enough money and positive reinforcement to keep drivers on the road a little longer. These are not good situations. So it's guiding companies to move away from exploitative things. And yeah, deciding there's some things that we want to do that are purely manual. There's some instances where we want to have AI and technology supporting the people. And then there's some instances where they can collaborate and work really cool together and we can get the best of both worlds. But thinking about this explicitly is critical. And then lastly, on the innovation front, we need to stop thinking that building a chatbot or building a machine learning platform is just like building a website or building another piece of software. This doesn't work. I've talked with so many different developers and heads of teams that look at this stuff and they ultimately say it keeps failing because we keep trying to do sprints, but we don't even know what data we have. Or we keep trying to do sprints, but we don't even know how we can modify that data to use it in an applicable way. Our AI projects need to be a lot more like a design thinking project, but instead of just looking at the people in the system and just looking at how we could do something that has a lot of benefit to users, sometimes we have to do stuff like data audits to figure out, well, what is even possible? What's feasible with what you have? We have to do expert interviews to better understand what do people who really know this technology say that you could do? And then, of course, we also look at, what do people want? And what's possible in the future? Where's this technology going? Because it's changing so quickly that if you're not building for tomorrow, by the time you launch, it's already going to be behind. And so this is where you can start to think about taking things all the way into opportunities, ideas, and then within my shop, I'm going to be very, very fortunate to be working with buddies like my friend Jacob, who's going to be able to do on the media side, and my good friend Charlie, who's going to be doing downstream implementation. I'm starting to build partnerships because I realize that this stuff is so big that I can't do it alone. And lastly, and this is going to sit at the core of this company, is how do we design this stuff to be humane? And this isn't just going to be at the core of this company. This is 2 chapters in now to this book. I've started thinking about the last 20 years that I've spent in this space, and I realize I've got something to say, that I've learned enough about technology to know how we can do better. The first thing is just the golden rule of technology. Don't build tech that you wouldn't use. The Valley sadly does not seem to adhere to this because you keep hearing about people at Facebook that are not even users of Facebook or Instagram because they know the dangers. That's unethical. If you won't use your own technology, there's something wrong with it. Secondly, you need to respect the human role in the system. Yes, this is a whole system that involves important technology, but also people are important too. Third, be transparent with what you're trying to do. I'm gonna give you free advice. If you see an artificial system out there that you're playing with that you think is really cool, and you don't explicitly know who owns it, what its objectives are, and what capabilities it has, stop using that system. We should expect all of the systems that we work with to be transparent about those three fundamental and basic things. You should know what is its intent with you as a user. Otherwise, who knows what it could be doing with you. 4, people have boundaries. I'm not gonna come up to each of you at this party and be like, hey, how's your evening going? How's your evening going? You having a good time? Because that's annoying. So why do we allow our smartphone apps to do that? And God forbid, when those things start to have a face or a voice, do we want that in our homes, in our bedrooms? No. We need to also communicate the limits of this technology because you look at something like ChatGPT and it's amazing, but the one thing that they didn't do is tell you, well, wait, this is where it maybe doesn't work as well. And people have been hacking it and finding all sorts of weird edge cases where it gets basic mathematics or basic ethics wrong. And so if you're somebody who's trying to learn high school history and it's giving you false information, that's a problem. So these systems also need to be telling you where it doesn't work as well so that you can make an informed decision and right-size the trust that you have in these things. We need to design for people other than ourselves. The Valley has a white hetero-cis male problem, and I realize I am the standing embodiment of that. But I'd like to think I've been exposed to enough incredible people in my life that I know how to draw on other experiences. And if I'm going to design a new system, I know how to get other people in the room to make sure that that system is not just designed for me, like so many things coming out of the Valley have been. And lastly, and this one should be obvious, but don't be creepy, guys. There's so many things that have been coming out through technology in these last years that you look at and you just cringe because it feels gross. I want technology to feel like the Legos I played with as a kid again. I want it to feel like the GeoCities page that I built in the 90s, or the little things that I would take apart my dad's radio with and put back together. I don't want it to feel like it's causing me to be depressed or ruining my life. This is not difficult stuff, but it's so important and we're not getting it right. So, all that said, this is the start of the ride. Thank you so much. Please stick around, and I'm so thankful you're all here. I love you all dearly.